And welcome again to our quarterly Wally's FAIRtax World webinar. How you doing, Jade?
Good, Bob. How are you?
All right. Now, congratulations. You are now the newest board member for Americans for Fair Taxation. That's pretty cool.
That is great. That is great. I just got the invoice for a $100,000 payment due. I didn't realize that was part of the transaction. I just.
Oh, I bet you. Well, I guarantee they can use your expertise up there, and that's a really good choice, and congratulations on that.
No, I appreciate it. It's a great group of people. None of them get paid, all volunteer, and it's a labor of love.
All right. Well, let's dig in here since we've only got an hour to play with. Our stream, if it goes over an hour, they make you split it into two parts. But I imagine if you and I are probably similar in this regard. In school, I was a math guy, math and science. English Lit was not my class, not my subject. But I do remember the famous quote. I can't tell you where it's from or who wrote it or anything of the like, but I do remember the quote. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Now, somebody who knows English Lit will be sitting, what's that idiot? How come he doesn't know whatever that is? But I'm thinking that really applies to the economy as we've seen it in just, the 8 months of 2020. In January and February, we were going great guns. There's several different measures by which you can determine how well the economy's performing. We were hitting it out of the park on just about all of them. Then this COVID thing comes along. It gets politicized, so it ends up being twice as bad as it really needs to be. But we went from having an incredibly good economy to an incredibly bad economy. So what we want to talk about in this edition of Wally's World is what the impact of the fair tax would be on the economy. So give us, to start with, just kind of a broad overview, then we'll dig into the details a bit later.
Okay, absolutely. So we won't go a tale of two cities. We're going to go economy.
Oh, is that what that is?
That's from a tale of two cities.
Okay.
So let me lead with something that the experts can agree on, and I don't say this lightly. Agreement. These days, more than ever, it seems there are fewer things that a large majority of people can agree on. Well, virtually all credentialed economists agree that three things will promote economic growth. So you're like, well, what are those three things? If everyone agrees, what are those?
Let's do it, yeah.
Replacing the income tax with a consumption tax, replacing a graduated rate system with a flat marginal tax rate system, and lowering marginal rates and a broader tax base. The fair tax does all three of these things. 3 different independent research studies analyze the likely effect of adopting the fair tax, which is a national sales tax with a prebate that would replace our current income and payroll tax system. These studies were not a study searching for data to support a preconceived notion. These studies cost millions and millions of grassroots donation dollars and were performed by well-known economists and really powerhouse economists such as the Beacon Hill Institute, Donna Arduin, the former director of the Office of Management and Budget for the state of Alaska. She's a president of an economics company. She's consultant for former Florida Governor Rick Scott, and now Senator Scott, as well as for Meg Whitman, the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, Jeb Bush's budget director, New York Governor Pataki's deputy budget director. She's accomplished. Lawrence Kotlikoff, another author of these studies, Boston University professor of economics. And also, Lawrence is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the Econometric Society, research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it goes on. Alan Auerbach, another contributor to these studies we'll talk about. He's a Harvard-educated gentleman, currently the director of the Center for Tax Policy and Public Finance of the University of California at Berkeley.
Hang on just
Michael Boskin.
Let me clarify something real quick. All of these studies that you're talking about is not the original $20 million worth of research that went into the fair tax when they were trying to design it and hatch it. This is new studies on top of all that, correct?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of them were after the studies established what would be the best system. and then the fair tax was established. So some of these happened after that, so in the mid-2000s.
Yeah, so this is research that was done on top of the research that was done that created the fair tax in the first place. Okay,
yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Michael Boston, another contributor, California, Berkeley educated, currently the professor of economics, senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. Dr. Dale Jorgensen, one of the famous ones, Harvard University economics professor, and he was the head of the Harvard's economic department for several years. Then there's many other reputable economists involved with this research, but I wanted to give you in the audience a little flavor of the caliber of economic professionals that produce the results that we'll dive into now. So there were three unique and distinct modeling approaches used for each study, three studies. The executive summaries that all three of the studies showed that cumulative key metric growth under the fair tax is significantly higher than it would otherwise be if the current income and payroll tax system remained in place. So just a couple of numbers without getting too granular. GDP goes up 10 to 11% by year 10. Employment, it's up 4 to 12% in year 1, goes up to 8 to 9% higher by year 10. Real wages, which is a key number, right? That's what's in your pocket. 10 to 27% higher in year 1, up to 41% higher, depending on the study, by year 10. Consumption. Some people think, wow, with a fair tax, if you're going to tax consumption, it's going to go down. In year 1, the studies show a slight 0.5% decrease up to 2% increase, and by year 10, up to 12% increase in consumption with the fair tax.
Wow, I guess if people have more money to spend, then they're more likely to spend it. That sounds pretty simple.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back to what you and Ron have talked about on Fair Tax Power Radio, Stephen Moore's recent.
Yeah, I was about to bring that up to you. There's another name I could toss out to you. This was one of the president's economic advisors. Now, excuse me. He wasn't talking specifically about the fair tax, but his words were replacing the income tax with a consumption tax would be rocket fuel for the economy.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think the statistics we just went over prove that. We're talking significant increases to real wage growth, GDP, consumption, earnings. It's hard to compete with that.
All right, let me toss out another little hypothetical for you. When we've seen stuff like this COVID shutdown, the economy suffers some kind of blow or it goes into recession or what, would not having the fair tax versus the income tax make recovery so much easier, so much more robust, and so much faster?
I believe so, Bob. If we look at historical statistics, and this surprised me when I first researched this, personal consumption expenditures, call it PCE, is much more consistent even through recessions and downtimes than income, or like a measure of income such as adjusted gross income. The income figures fluctuate wildly with economic ups and downs. Personal consumption expenditures, not as much more smooth. What does that mean? That means it's a much smoother, more predictable income flow as far as our U.S. Treasury receipts, which means there's less pressure on budgets and cuts and things that are important from the spending side of the ledger. So I definitely agree with you, Paul.
People who are no longer working are no longer paying the tax, but these people still buy things. So the consumption would a consumption-based tax system would be a lot more stable for the government than an income-based one. Excuse me.
Absolutely. I always like to say consumption comes from four things. It comes from income, but it also comes from borrowing, and then it also comes from theft, if you think about it, and it comes from savings.
Yeah, we won't go there.
Yeah. You've got four sources for consumption. Income only comes from income.
Yeah, well, I will note, excuse me, I don't know what this frog in my throat is, but the fair tax would make a taxpayer out of somebody who makes his living in a less than legal way. You know, somebody who robs banks is not going to report the proceeds of his work on a federal income tax return, but he's still going to buy stuff.
That's exactly right. Think about all the illegal underground economy. Absolutely. They all have to spend to live. Even the folks illegally present in the United States, 99%, if not 100%, are probably not filling out federal tax returns. They'll pay their full federal burden now as they consume.
Yeah, and without, excuse me, again, without the legal status, they don't get the prebate, so they're taxed even higher. They'd be
That's exactly right.
a disincentive to have illegal immigration under the fair tax.
And flip it the other way, it's a natural incentive to legally immigrate the right way through the right channels.
All right. Well,
and by the way, with the fair tax, we need more immigrants than ever before, Bob.
Because the economy is going to take off. There'll be a higher demand for workers. There'll be more and more jobs. You know, I remember your phrase now, first mover advantage, that the first industrialized country that gets rid of their corporate income tax is going to have a tremendous inflow of manufacturing, something we need to bring back from countries that aren't really friendly to us, and just everything. All of that business and all of those jobs are going to come flowing to the first country that does that. We got to make sure it's the U.S. of A.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, well,
so you want to talk about some invisible challenges?
Yeah, that's where I was going to move on. We're up against some challenges that the economy we've never seen. Kind of what are we up against, and what are some of the visible and invisible challenges that we'll have to be facing, and how will the fair tax help you meet those?
Sure. I think there's a model, and I've seen some presentations recently that opened my eyes around a lot of challenges that our economy will face. I think this pandemic has opened some eyes to some challenges, but a way to think about it is through the acronym ADAPT, A-D-A-P-T. So if we go through words that represent each of those letters: asymmetry, disruption, age, polarization, and trust. So what the heck does all that mean, Jay? Well, let's go to asymmetry. It relates to an increasing wealth disparity and the erosion of the middle class. Now, I'm going to qualify this aspect by saying that in the current administration, over a 2 to 3 year period, wages have grown at their fastest rate, with wage gains exceeding 3%, the first time since 2009. The low-income bracket's pay has risen in the past 3 years at a faster rate than high earners. That's never happened before for decades. Apart from this anomaly, let's call it this 2 to 3 year anomaly, if you will, for decades the U.S. middle class has shrunk, and there's been an increasing wealth disparity along with rapidly rising national debt, as you're familiar, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
The middle class, apart from the past 3 years, is, I would say it's troublesome in the fact that U.S. residents are actually living more affluently despite stagnant wages and housing costs rising much faster than income growth. So what does that lead to? That leads to more debt and the shocking phenomenon that 42% of Americans retire broke right now. And by broke, the threshold used is having less than $10,000 in liquid resources.
Wow, yeah.
The stat is from the 2018 banking rates survey.
Yeah, that won't last you long in retirement.
Yeah. Further, some other challenges. Student loan debt outstanding has increased from $600 billion in 2006 to $1 trillion in 2010, $1.4 trillion in 2015, and now $1.8 trillion in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So $600 billion in 06, $1.8 trillion in 2020. That's a 300% increase in 14 years. The rooster's going to have to come home on that at some point. Lastly, Bob, nearly 40% of U.S. jobs are at risk from automation. Obviously, there's tremendous opportunity with automation for jobs, but when it comes to a country with a large population like our 330 million Americans, 40% of jobs being at risk is a mind-boggling figure. So that's part of the equation for A. What about disruption? We said D. We just spoke about the risk of job loss from automation. This new automation will disrupt a great deal of what you and I think of as a normal day-to-day activities, work, and society in general. For example, companies and institutions are leaning in further on technologies such as 3D printing, drones, AI, augmented reality, bots, machine learning, visualization tools like Tableau, as well as RPA, that's robotic process automation, just to name a few disruptors. Massive loss of work and transformation of work may lead to regional shift as industry sectors are disrupted. There will be continuous change in the relationships between people and technology. and technology capital will increasingly be a differentiator, and institutions will struggle to evolve and be at risk of failing. Great news, right? It's hard to be the harbinger of bad news, Bob. But A is for age. There's increasing demographic pressure on business in the U.S., on business, social institutions, and economies, with the global population set to reach 8.5 billion by 2030, just 10 short years from now.
Wow.
I know. In the aging economies, older workers will need to work longer, sorry, Bob, and learn new skills to remain relevant. Moreover, governments may seek to supplement the workforce with migrant populations. At the same time, the numbers of very old will increase too, putting a strain on healthcare, pensions, entitlement programs, and public debt.
Well, that's why I retired. My skill set became obsolete. That happens.
And, you think about implications. Consumption patterns are going to shift. Potential capacity mismatches across countries, infrastructure, investments, organizational capacity, and organizational capability of people. People will not be able to afford to retire. It will be a significant drain on the system. Managing new welfare programs in conjunction with an erosion on the tax base in our current income tax system will put increasing pressure on the government. Consumption-based sectors will experience a shutdown in countries with older populations like the U.S. And another set of great news. Polarization is the P in ADAPT. The word is certainly top of mind with all the turmoil in certain U.S. cities right now. Growing animosity among people with different opinions. There's chaos, confusion, and disruption. It has the potential to disrupt entire societies and governmental institutions. As societal polarization becomes more extreme, and as loud voices drown out other day-to-day responsibilities, issues, and grievances, the effect will have tributary downstream effects into the U.S. economy and businesses. Lastly, trust, the T in ADAPT. Trust in our institutions that underpin society on all sides is declining all over the world, just like in the U.S. This rising skepticism will make it harder for the U.S. economy to change for the better, while government regulations on data, interpretations of what is the truth, and other regulations could have drastic effects on the U.S. economy. So, Bob, this is just a summary of, we use the ADAPT acronym, of a lot of things that we kind of knew were there, and we felt it, but when we lay it all out like that, it's like, whoa, wow, we've got some challenges upcoming in the coming years and decades that our U.S. economy will face that we need a solution for.
All right, well, let's go there. If you've certainly enumerated a lot of challenges and a lot of issues that the economy in the United States is going to face, let's apply the FAIRtax. Go back point by point, apply the FAIRtax to each of those things you've talked about, and elaborate on how the FAIRtax would make it better than it is right now with the income tax.
Okay, so let's start with asymmetry on ADAPT. The key here is wealth disparity. As we discussed earlier, the FAIRtax is perhaps the single most important piece of legislation that will significantly increase wealth and prosperity for the U.S. middle class, and even bring more of our working poor into the ranks of a solid middle class. Remember, after 10 years with the FAIRtax, real wages will grow by up to 40% relative to where they are now. That is transformational. This leads to less U.S. retirees being broke and a reversal of the middle class erosion experienced over the past few decades. Disruption. We mentioned things such as AI, data visualization, bots, drones, and RPA. The great thing about the FAIRtax is that it encourages more work, more entrepreneurship, and more companies setting up headquarters and facilities here in the U.S., which means more workers are needed. The FAIRtax eliminated or will eliminate the cumbersome corporate income tax and will make the U.S. the world's tax haven. So while all these disruptions will certainly come crashing towards us at speeds we can't even imagine, the FAIRtax, for the first country to adopt it, like you said, Bob, that's first mover advantage, creates a natural hedge against these agents of disruption and protects our American worker with more job opportunities, be they high-tech or manual, white or blue collar.
All right.
Age. So there's a real problem, especially in certain industries like utilities and energy, with an aging population and fewer young workers wanting to take the mantle from that older generation. The FAIRtax, again, creates an economic environment that's on fire. There will be millions of more jobs needed than qualified people available. This will actually motivate the U.S. to increase merit-based immigration, professionals with strong skill sets that will help fill the gap of our aging U.S. population.
Mm-hmm.
The fair tax doesn't completely solve the job training issues of our aging population. However, this is what we call a good problem, Bob. If there are more available jobs than we know what to do with, let's deal with that problem in the future. But the fair tax definitely helps there. Polarization. The current U.S. income and payroll tax system is one of the most significant contributors to polarization in our society. Every 2 or 4 years, you guys know, the class warfare theme is dragged out of the attic and used to separate and divide our great U.S. country into demographic groups, age groups, and income brackets. One of the most elegant and natural benefits of the fair tax is that it eliminates the income tax, which inherently divides people into the different groups, which inevitably leads to finger pointing among those groups. With the fair tax, everyone pays the same rate for their consumption. Great, one same rate. Everyone's treated the same. We qualify and adhere to the 14th Amendment of equal protection under the law. But in a stroke of brilliance, thanks to the prebate, the rich, who consume much more than those who spend less, pay a dramatically higher rate the more they spend.
Mm-hmm.
For example, considering the prebate, a family of 4 spending at the $35,000 poverty level has a 0% tax rate. If they spend 40 grand, 3% rate. Spend 50 grand, 7% rate. See where I'm going here? Spend 100 grand, 15% rate. Spend $1 million, 22.2% rate.
Mm-hmm.
And the rate gradually and asymptotically, I love that word, asymptotically reaches 23%. It's like if you can imagine a graph, because of the prebate, it will never reach 23%, but become increasingly closer to it. For example, if you spent a gazillion billion, you'd be at 22.99999% tax rate.
Uh-huh.
Thus, the fair tax doesn't have a graduated rate that divides people, but because of the prebate, remains progressive and fair on the working poor.
All right,
Lastly, let's go to trust.
Go ahead. I was going to ask you one more thing before we left that thing. You know, could it be that the politicians that are making hay over this class warfare thing are opposing the fair tax because they want to keep the issue rather than solve the problem?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's insightful because there is, call it an industry of grievances that makes a lot of people a lot of money. That is going to be one of the natural things we as fair tax supporters will have to overcome. But I really believe in America, if we educate enough people and enough people are aware of the fair tax and its benefits, it's common sense. Like you and Ron say on FAIRtax Power Radio, once you understand it, you'll demand it. And you've never really had a thoughtful conversation with someone who asked about the fair tax, learned about it, and said, you know, that's horrible. It just doesn't happen. So I have faith in America that if we can get there, as far as an education regime, we will get to the place where it will happen. But you're right, that's an obstacle to overcome because a lot of people make a lot of money when people disagree and have grievances toward each other.
Okay, well, I just had to toss that in for you. You can continue on to your last little trust point there.
So the T, trust. One of the biggest concerns in the U.S. is mistrust of Congress. We've all seen the ratings of Congress.
Oh, yeah.
They continually receive contributions to amend the U.S. income tax code. It's a vicious cycle.
We look at that every week.
You do. People feel helpless to stop it, but they get lobby dollars to define municipal solid waste in the income tax code.
Yeah, we've looked at that too. Yeah, that's insane.
But people aren't ignorant to it, and they realize it's a tax code written by millionaires for millionaires. They just don't know what to do. And I think there's a growing angst there. The working men and women, they get the shaft, thanks in part to the regressive payroll tax that brings in nearly half of our U.S. Treasury's receipts, by the way. The fair tax gets our government, politicians, and lobbyists out of the way of our incredible U.S. companies, innovators, and workers. The trust quotient will increase dramatically under the fair tax, as tinkering with the tax code for special interests and the highest campaign contributions will be gone forever. There will be still be declining confidence in many U.S. institutions, undoubtedly, but one of the most notorious institutions of ill repute will be eliminated and an incredible amount of freedom re-gifted to the American people. plus the government, and that institution, by the way, I was talking about is the IRS, plus the government, with all of the coming storm of problems we just talked about, doesn't have the time, ability, or resources to inspect, track, monitor, and safely store data about each American's bank accounts, investments, charitable contributions and organizations, car mileage, make, model, and year, home office square footage as a percentage of our home's total square footage, mileage spent on business or charitable endeavors, earnings reported by our employers, tax court arguments, proceedings and rulemakings, and the list goes on. Right now, that's what the IRS has to process, collect, and safeguard for all of us. That all goes away. They have enough problems. We just went through them with the ADAPT acronym. They have enough problems coming without needing to do all of that with our taxes.
Oh, mercy.
So overall, Bob, while not a complete panacea to the issues our economy will face, the FAIRtax single-handedly eliminates or reduces many of the aforementioned anticipated ill effects of the coming storms we'll face in America. We'll need other remedies to be sure, but I can't think of one other singular piece of legislation that solves so many of our current and future problems with one fell swoop. Can you?
Oh, I cannot, but I can think of one more question for you. How does an institution like Congress, whose approval rating is in the single digits, have like a 98% re-election rate for incumbents? That just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's oxymoronic.
It is. I guess everybody hates everybody else's congressman. I like my congressman, so I'm going to keep re-electing him, but I don't like the rest of them. So maybe that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah, that's funny.
Let me move on and kind of look at another side of this coin here. I think you've pretty well made the case that the FAIRtax would set the U.S. economy on fire, and it would be so strong, there'd be so many jobs coming in here. And what would that make the dollar a lot stronger? If we had a much stronger dollar, because the FAIRtax has lit the economy on fire with rocket fuel. And talk about how that would happen and what the effects of that would be in the global market. Would that not make U.S. exports harder to sell because of the really strong U.S. dollar?
Bob, that's the dumbest question I've ever heard. No,
Oh, I'll think of another one for you if you really want to. I'll take that as a challenge and see what we can.
No, Bob, I say that in full jest. That's a natural, actual thought that people have. Well, okay, I'm going to buy everything that all these PhDs and world-class economists say. The economy's going to be on fire with the FAIRtax. Well, let's think about consequences. And consequences is a stronger U.S. dollar, which in theory could hurt exports. Great question. But to me, that's like saying, don't win because the others will then become upset and will then try to defeat you. Let's just stay in 10th place so the first 9 teams won't get upset with us for beating them. It's preposterous. It's now, and I say on exports, it's not like we're slaying it right now. Our current trade deficit is nearly $50 billion a year. We need to be a little bit more competitive internationally, a lot more competitive. I have faith in our U.S. manufacturers. We're the most freedom-loving, dynamic, and innovative inventors and engineers in the world. We just need a current income tax system, or a current system, that gets out of the way. Many inputs into the U.S. manufacturing process are from abroad. These raw materials, okay, so think about it, Bob. You're a widget maker, and you sell. You're going to sell your product abroad. But if you buy your raw materials purchased from elsewhere, they'll be much cheaper with the stronger U.S. dollars. That is, our U.S. dollar will buy more Indonesian or Chinese inputs and raw materials because the U.S. dollar is now stronger relative to those currencies. Mm-hmm. Our one U.S. dollar will buy many more rupiahs or wons now. This will drive the overall cost of the U.S. made goods down further, making the end cost cheaper, at least partially offsetting the stronger dollar's effect on international sales. You know, if the production process is entirely in the U.S., from raw materials to finished product, then when U.S. companies sell abroad, there will be no tax buildup into the cost of the item, and the FAIRtax will not be charged on goods sold outside the U.S. Overall, this will bring a lower selling price to international customers relative to the current state, even if our U.S. dollar is stronger. For example, now, a U.S.-made widget has 22% of its cost due to the embedded cost of the income and payroll tax system. All things being equal, with the fair tax, the item is 22% cheaper. When selling abroad with no fair tax in the sales price, this may actually more than offset the strong U.S. dollar that will undoubtedly result from fair tax enactment. Problem solved.
The European widgets don't have that 22% based in their price, and they can undercut us.
Exactly.
So, all right. So that fixes the strong dollar problem. Let's switch gears again. Talk to me about evasion. That's something we like to talk about a lot on FAIRtax Power Radio.
Yes, and we didn't talk about that as a coming problem, but it definitely should be on that list. There's a 2017 study by Dr. Sabula, and he highlighted how the gross tax gap. Now, you'll talk about the income tax gap, but the gross tax gap is really the true gap between what we should collect based on law and what we don't, including not just the income that's underreported, but all the deductions that are overreported and everything. That's about $800 billion a year now, growing to $1 trillion a year by 2026.
Wow.
So that's just laying it out there to answer your question. That's a huge problem.
All right. So obviously, if there's no income tax to evade, I actually heard somebody say the other day, there'll be a lot more evasion under the fair tax than there will be with the income tax. Now, I don't know what planet he was from, but compare what the evasion rate between the two. I mean, you've undoubtedly seen it in your professional workings.
Absolutely, and so I've helped the AFF with a recent study where I extrapolate some data from some other studies from some really high-powered economists and professors and PhDs. So when we utilize existing sales tax evasion studies and extrapolate to the U.S. as a whole with fair tax adoption, we would go from a current 20.8% gross tax gap percentage in 2019, that's $780 billion in 2019 we should have collected but didn't, to 1.1% of gross tax revenues, or $41 billion. I'll say that again. Let that sink in. We go from $780 billion annual illegal evasion under the income tax to $41 billion under the fair tax. Bob, can you guess the percentage decline in illegal tax evasion that equates to?
Well, not off the top of my head. I'll just ask you because you probably already researched it.
I put you on the spot. I just did the calculator earlier. That's a 95% reduction in illegal tax evasion going from the income tax to the fair tax. That's a game changing to our economy, our U.S. Treasury receipts, and how much we need to charge our citizens going forward.
So, if you've got that much more money coming into to Congress, do you think they will actually use it to reduce the debt, or will they just spend it like they do everything else?
Yeah, that's probably outside the purview of what we as fair tax supporters are after. Again, we're just after a system that collects the same amount of revenue but does it more efficiently, effectively, and less intrusively. I think there'll always be the risk of politicians wanting to spend that money. I think Thomas Jefferson was quoted as saying that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. So it'll be on you and I as citizens to curtail the spending. And with all that extra money coming in under the fair tax because of less evasion, I think it's up to the politicians at that point. It's like, well, do I want to lower the rate on people that we charge, or do we want to pay down some of the debt? Or do we want to just spend more? That'll be a separate conversation.
Well, let me ask you directly a question that we kind of asked rhetorically a couple of episodes ago on the FAIRtax Power Radio. Why do people put up with this crazy income tax system? Who could possibly oppose replacing that crazy thing with a fair tax other than the lobbyists that are making millions of dollars off of it?
Good question. And I think it's worth some examination. When we really dive in and say, okay, fine, we're passing the fair tax, or we're getting close to it, who's going to really, we know the lobbyists and the lawyers that make $500,000 salaries per year by petitioning their congressmen or women to get the tax code changed. We know there's going to be huge opposition there. But where else will there be real legitimate opposition? Let's think about companies such as Walmart or other large retailers who purchase goods from China or other countries. They won't have their costs reduced by 22% on average So again, with embedded taxes falling out of the cost of U.S. made goods, prices will go down dramatically, and then you add the fair tax back on, virtually offsetting. But if you're buying all your goods from China or another country, you're not getting that drop in the embedded taxes falling out because they're not made in the U.S. Imagine all U.S. manufactured goods and retail services having their prices drop dramatically given the end of an embedded income and payroll tax cost in the prices to the tune of 22%. Well, if Bob Paxton Stores Group, you're a conglomerate now, Bob, I don't know if you knew that, you sell bowling balls. You sell bowling balls, but you buy your balls from Papua New Guinea, and you pay 100 kina, that's the currency there, 100 kina per ball you sell.
I knew that.
You're still going to pay 100 kina per ball, all things being equal. That price won't drop by 22%, right? Mm-hmm. That's the rub. So now, for raw materials purchased abroad, but processed into finished goods here in the U.S., there will be varying degrees of U.S. cost reduction with the fair tax enactment, from 0%, let's take a Chinese whoopee cushion that we purchase and we ship to Walmart. It's just completely Chinese made, to percentages all the way up to 22% on average for goods sourced and produced entirely in the U.S. So it's gonna have a hybrid. I'll tell you a quick story.
Okay.
So Steve Hayes, the president of the AFFT, who you guys have talked to on Fair Tax Power Radio, he had a story about a large retailer that I won't name by name, but has recently gone through bankruptcy, and it's a household name. They, this is decades ago, talking to Steve, they had written a letter to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and basically said, listen, if you go forward with any kind of consumption tax idea, we're going to pull our support for you, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, because that would hurt us because we buy a lot of our products from abroad. We wouldn't get that embedded tax cost reduction, and it would be like a 23% increase on everything we sell, and it wouldn't make us competitive. So I think you're going to have real opposition there from certain retailers. But let me go through a reality of something.
Okay.
Let's say you're Juan Paxton. You're not Bob Paxton. You're Juan Paxton from Argentina.
See.
And you're a bowling ball company, and you sold to the U.S. Would you just roll over and let your business evaporate? Because now the bowling balls made in the U.S. are much more cost competitive. The 22% of cost drops out. So if I'm the bowling store and I'm not going to buy from Juan Paxton anymore in Argentina, right? If you're Juan Paxton, are you just going to roll over? Or are you going to tighten your belt, lower your costs, lower your prices to keep some of that business as you sell your bowling balls to the U.S.? It's competition. Competition drives prices down further, thanks to the fair tax. Also, you and I buying Chinese-made whoopee cushions at Walmart now are buying these goods with after-tax dollars. So in effect, we're still paying the U.S. tax premium now, but wouldn't be under the fair tax given the increase in purchasing power we'd have, which would also help these types of retail stores like Walmart or other clothing stores that purchase many of their products from other countries. This is a great segue into what the fair tax naturally encourages so elegantly without manipulating behavior like the current U.S. income tax code attempts to do. I've inexorably led you down a path that culminates with the conclusion that the fair tax will naturally incentivize made in the USA like never before. Mm-hmm. Plus, we're in a global economy which we can't escape. So when U.S. businesses do purchase foreign-made goods, the fair tax creates a more level playing field and will make all goods purchased cheaper for U.S. businesses since they'll have to compete with American-made goods now with that embedded tax cost eliminated. Oh. I think if anyone, Bob, tried to design a system with more inherent benefits, they'd be incapable of doing it. The fair tax is so unique in that its simplicity naturally strengthens our U.S. economy like nothing else could ever fathom doing.
Okay, well, that's actually a factor that I hadn't really thought of before, because I have always just, scratching your head and wonder what's going on. Why would not a major retailer like Walmart, who gets to keep a little bit of the fair tax that they collect, but why would any business choose to continue to have to hire an army of tax accountants? The compliance cost of complying with the tax code is enormous. And I was just wondering what would possibly cause somebody not to want that cost of doing business to drop off their balance sheet.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's some natural conflict there, but I think in the end, even those large retailers, and obviously I just use Walmart because it's a known name. I have no idea their position on a national retail sales tax. But I do believe if there's proper education, that you're right in that all retailers, the Small Business Association of America already supports the FAIRtax. They've endorsed us. I think those larger retailers buying products from abroad, we have to do a little bit more education there. But all in, all factors considered, it's still a winning proposition because you're going to have people with more money in their pocket who are going to buy more stuff. Bottom line.
Yeah, could it be that the large corporations that can afford the billions of dollars in lobbyists feel like they are buying a competitive advantage with the income tax system, and that getting rid of it would rob them of that advantage?
I think you hit on something that's very true, unfortunately. But if you're a big player and you can afford lobbyists and you can afford to tilt, maybe not where it's just ridiculously to your advantage, but you can afford to have lobbyists go advocate for a position that helps give you a competitive advantage versus smaller businesses that can't do that. Why would you want to change?
I don't know, but we did a little bit of research on a couple of FTPR episodes back of exactly how many lobbying dollars are being tossed about. The numbers are staggering. I'll give you the same lead that Steve Hayes gave us. Go to opensecrets.org and poke around in there at the lobbying thing, and you will be amazed at how much is going on, how much money is involved. What companies are lobbying things that you would think their company, their business would have no interest in, like Boeing, the commercial airplane builder, was lobbying the CARES Act. We discovered that.
Wow.
So
wow.
Go check that out.
Yeah, I will do that. Who would have thought? Yeah. But I understand, Bob. It's the income tax code is the second most lobbied area or theme on K Street in Washington, D.C., next only to pharmaceuticals, which says something about our income tax code.
Yeah, well, we looked it up on opensecrets.org. I think it said the federal budget, just kind of a catch-all, was number one. Pharmaceuticals was number two. Taxes was number three. But if you don't consider that federal budget, it's right up there. There's more lobbying on taxes than there is on education. There's more lobbying on taxes than there is on defense. There's more lobbying on taxes than there is on just about any other thing you can name. It's insane. But
that is insane.
Oh,
I vehemently agree with you, Bob.
Oh. All right. Well, are there any other little things you'd like to wrap up? And I got another little thing I want to pick your brain on first, but I'll give you a chance to wrap up any points that you want to bring on.
No, just wanted to make sure I answered your questions.
Okay, well, good. I want to pick your little CPA brain on this particular issue. We ran across an article on Fox Business a while back that made it look like that the computer systems at the IRS are just on the verge of collapse. They're, over 2 decades old. And most people would think, if the computer systems at the IRS collapse and they can't do their business anymore, most people would cheer that. What are some of the impacts that people might not think about that could come about if the IRS's computers suddenly stopped working tomorrow morning?
Yeah, it's a great question. So much of what how our U.S. Treasury collects receipts is dependent on IRS systems, all the returns that come in, sorting through that data, fraud checks, identity theft checks. All of that data is really the lifeblood of our whole U.S. Treasury. So if you think about a catastrophic failure there, you really could have some systemic detrimental effects to our entire U.S. Treasury, which affects the entire U.S. budget, the entire U.S. economy, all our institutions, etc. So, it could be the stuff of Hollywood, suspense type movies for sure. The thing I think about, Bob, too, is think about all the checks that the IRS needs to do with all this data that we have to send in, like some of the information we mentioned earlier, bank accounts, charitable organizations, mileage, home square footage, et cetera, et cetera. All of that information and all the projects you have to do, that takes time and money, and that's why the IRS budget's $12 billion of your and my tax dollars every single year. And I remember I heard once, I can't remember the FAIRtax Power Radio episode, Bob, you and Ron talked about, in 2016, the IRS, they knew about this issue for many years, but they didn't tell 1 million Americans that illegals had stolen their Social Security numbers from IRS computers. This is in an August 2016 Washington Times article. Can you imagine that? Under the FAIRtax, none of that data is collected that's not even capable of being stolen. So
it's no longer collected.
As a golfer, it takes the hazard out of play. You don't even have that information in any government database. It all just magically goes away, and it takes the hazard out of play. And also, I remember a statistic, there's approximately 1 million hacking attempts a day on IRS databases and systems. 1 million per day. Now, obviously, there's some strong firewalls, etc., but eventually one of those is going to get through, and if it gets to the point where it's catastrophic, Bob, to our earlier conversation, who knows the effects of that?
I was going to ask you, what would that effect be on just John Q. Citizen that's sitting in his day-to-day life if the IRS suddenly couldn't do what they need to do?
Yeah, that's...
And I know I'm tossing you a curveball there, but let's see if you can hit it.
Well, I think there'd be so many unintended consequences that you and I can't even think of the ramifications right now. Obviously, if the systems go down, think about if it's March and April season. What about the 60 to 70, 80% of filers who get a tax refund? Sorry, we can't process your tax refund now because our systems are down.
That'll get people's attention.
Yes, it will, and that will massively hurt the economy because a lot of those tax dollars, people inappropriately think of those as a gift from the government, even though it's just a prepaid loan to the government, right?
Yeah, you're getting back your own money. Most people don't understand that.
Exactly, but they use it as a bonus to go buy, that sea-doo for the lake or that couch in the living room or whatever. So you'd have a direct impact immediately on the economy, really, I think, if something like that happened, among many other things we can't think of at this juncture.
All right, so why don't we just put the IRS out of business so this is no longer a threat to any of us? We light the economy on fire with a FAIRtax. Who can be against that?
I like your idea, Bob. Let's do something about it.
All right, well, how about we come back in about 3 months and we'll have another discussion.
Okay, I like it. I like these conversations.
I do. Okay, you're watching Wally's FAIRtax World, and we're actually finished well above our time limit this time. We don't have to worry about splitting the video into 2 parts.
Excellent.
All right, well, you and your family get along well, and we will talk to you later.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate the time. Take care.
Okay, good night.